We've just finished up on a long discussion about how our application is really architected. We spoke about how it's working behind the scenes, and we also refactored some areas to make sure that our app works well in both the production and development environments. Now we're going to start to transition to moving on the front end of our application very shortly, but before we do, there's one last thing that I want to talk about that's going to be very applicable on both the back end and front ends of our application. So what we're going to be discussing is a little new piece of JavaScript syntax that's included with the ES 2017 release of JavaScript. If you recall, when we put together our services passport.js file, so here's the services passport.js file, when we were working on the Google strategy, so here's the Google strategy, we put together that second argument to the strategy, which was the callback function. Inside of here, we made use of promises with our request to the database to handle the sort of asynchronous nature of our code. Now, when we put this code together, I said several times, hey, if you don't really know promises, that's totally fine because we're going to refactor this anyways. This is what I'm talking about. Okay, we're going to learn this new syntax right now, and then we're going to come back to this snippet of code and refactor it to use this new type of syntax. That's going to allow us to kind of skirt really dealing with promises directly. Now this new syntax that we're going to use is going to be used on both the back end and the front ends of our application. And so obviously it's really important that we have a reasonable understanding of what this new syntax is doing for us. Okay, so here's how we're going to learn about it. We are going to create a new little snippet of code, just a little test function completely outside of our project. So we're going to write a little code completely outside of our project. We're going to test it. We're going to work with it a little bit. We're going to learn how this new syntax works. And then after we finish that, we will come back to this arrow function right here and refactor it to use this new syntax. So that's our goal. So with that in mind, I'm going to create a new file inside of my code editor. We're not going to save this file to our project. So you can write this code anywhere you want. We're not going to save it. This is just a location where we can write a little bit of sample code. That's all. Make sure I'm writing in JavaScript like so. Okay, so this is where we're going to write our sample code. Now, this is going to be like a little bit tough to go through because we're going to kind of cover a couple different topics at once. But hey, just believe me, at the end, everything will become clear. So for this sample snippet of code, for this little test function, I'm going to say that we want to write a function to retrieve a blob of JSON. So in other words, make an AJAX request. So I want to write a function that's going to make an AJAX request. To make the actual request, we are going to use the fetch, so use the fetch function. The fetch function is available with default JavaScript. It's a part of the standard library as of ES 2015. So we can use the fetch function to make AJAX requests to arbitrary endpoints from any web server out in existence. So in short, I want to write a function that's going to make an AJAX request to receive some amount of information, and I want internally to use the fetch API or the fetch function. So before we make an actual AJAX request, we have to have an actual URL to make the request to. So let's figure that part out first, and then we'll write this actual function. Inside my browser, I'm going to open up a new tab and navigate to rallycoding.herokuapp.com/API/music-albums. And I'll paste this inside my code editor so you can read it very easily in just a second. So as you can see, if we make a request to this route right here, we'll get back some arbitrary blob of JSON. So I'm going to go over to my code editor, and just so you can read it easily, I'm going to paste the link right here. So make sure that you can access this link, and when you access it, you should see a big old blob of JSON appear in the browser. One thing I want to point out in particular, notice that it's herokuapp.com, it's not heroku.com, okay? All right, so we've got our URL. We are going to write our function now, and internally it's going to use the fetch function. So I'm going to write my function. I'm going to call it fetch albums because we are fetching data on some music albums. And inside this function, we will use the fetch API to make a request to our route right here. Now here's the catch. Whenever we make a request with fetch, fetch returns a promise. That promise is resolved with an object that represents the underlying request. Now remember, anytime we work with a promise, to get kind of a little notification or a little callback that the promise has been resolved, we chain on a .then statement, like so. This .then will be called with the request coming from the original fetch call right here. So we usually receive that as an argument called res, short for response. And then to read the actual JSON data that we retrieved from this API, from this route right here, we call res.json, like so. And make sure you get the set of parentheses. So this is kind of how the fetch API works. It returns this response object. It represents the underlying request or the underlying response. To actually work with the real data that got returned, we have to call res.json, which returns a promise of its own that is resolved after the JSON in the request is ready for us to work with. So to get access to the actual JSON that is resolved or that is actually returned with this request, we chain on another .then that will be called with the JSON data that we care about. And so at that point, we can do whatever we want with the information that was returned. So in this case, I'll just console log it, like so. Finally, underneath the function declaration, I'll say fetch albums, like that. Okay, so now I want to test out this little code snippet inside the browser. Now, before we test it, I want to tell you right now, this snippet of code is only going to work for you if you are using a relatively modern browser that has support for fetch. So if you are using Chrome, you're going to be fine. If you're using Internet or Microsoft Edge, you're probably going to be okay. If you're using IE 10 or IE 9 for some reason, you're probably going to see an error message when we try this out. Okay, so just so you know. So I'm going to copy this entire blob right here. I will change back over to the browser. I'm going to open up the developer console. I'm going to go to the console tab. I will paste the snippet of code. I'll run it. And then after a little pause, I should see a console log with the 5 albums that are returned from this API. Okay? All right, so at this point, we've looked at and we've seen how traditional fetch requests work. It's something that's probably not that unusual to you. So at this point in time, we have essentially made some type of asynchronous request that returns a promise. When the request is successful, we can chain on a .then and pass it a function. That function will be called if the request is successfully resolved. So that .then is essentially our opportunity to get a little callback, something that says, hey, response is back here, you can now work with it. Now applying this to the actual fetch call we just did, so we called fetch, that returned a promise. We chained on the first .then because fetch resolves with an object representing the underlying request. To get the actual data, we have to call res.json. That returns another promise. And so to get a little notification when that promise is resolved, we chain on a second .then, which we can then use to get access to the real underlying data. So hopefully at this point, I just want to say, make sure we're really on the same page on fetch. Make sure we both understand why there's the 2 .then statements. I think that at this point we can agree and say, okay, yeah, this makes sense. We understand what's going on. So now let's do a little refactor to this function that's going to make use of this new ES 2017 syntax. Okay. Now the sole purpose of this new ES 2017 syntax is just to make working with promises a little bit easier and a little bit more straightforward. Behind the scenes, we're still working with promises. Fetch is still going to return a promise. We still are technically defining a function, we're still defining a block of code that will be only executed after the fetch statement or after this request is resolved. So we're still working with promises behind the scenes. The only difference is that this new ES 2017 syntax makes it visually look to our eyes, like your eyes and my eyes, like we are writing code that is a little bit more synchronous in nature, okay? So let's do our refactor and see what it looks like. I'm going to start off by copying the fetch albums function and then pasting it right underneath the existing one, just so we can kind of compare and contrast the two. So I'm going to comment out the existing one, and then we're going to do our refactor to use this new syntax on the new function, or on this copy of it. Okay, so the new syntax, just in case I didn't actually mention it, is called async await. It is specifically for handling asynchronous code inside of any type of function. So here's how we use it. We'll do it step by step. First, we identify the function inside of our code base that contains some type of asynchronous request or some type of asynchronous operation. And so in this case, we've got one function. Here it is, right here. So we've identified the function that contains some asynchronous code. Step one is to put the async keyword in front of that function declaration. So I'm going to say async space function. This essentially tells our JavaScript interpreter that the function that we are about to declare contains some asynchronous code. Now, step two is to identify all the different promises that are created within that function. In this case, we have two different promises. We have the one that is being created by calling fetch right here, and then we have the second promise that is being created by calling res.json. In front of each of those promises, we're going to add the await keyword. So I'm going to find fetch, I'm going to say await, I'm going to find the res.json, I'm going to delete everything around it and condense it down to be just res.json, and then put the await keyword in front of that. Finally, I'm going to assign the resolve value of fetch and JSON to some intermediate values. So in front of fetch, I'll say const res equals await fetch, and I'll say const JSON equals await res.json. And then finally, I will refactor the rest of the function to look essentially synchronous in nature. So I'll delete the entire .then statement down here and say simply console.log.json, like so. And that's essentially the entire refactor right there. So again, we first off identify any function in our code base that uses some type of asynchronous code or some type of promise inside of it. We put down the async keyword. We put the await keyword in front of any statement that produces a promise. And then in front of await the promise, we put down some variable to assign the resolve result of the promise to. So remember, before fetch was being resolved with the response, we are now assigning that to the res variable right here. Await JSON was being resolved with some amount of JSON, so we are assigning that to the JSON variable right here. Now, when we compare these two snippets of code, I can very easily say that this one is a little bit easier to understand what's going on, right? If you forget this entire like async await stuff, if you just forget the fact that it's new, just looking at these two functions, I think it's very easy to say this is easier to understand as far as like kind of what it's doing. We're essentially making a request, assign it to this variable, calling JSON or the JSON function on that variable, assigning the result to JSON, and then we console log out the response. This snippet up here, unless you really know what's going on with promises, it's a little bit harder to understand. And one of the hardest parts to understand is understanding that the promise that gets returned from res.json right here has to be resolved before the second .then statement is called. Like, that's a very intricate detail of promises and how promises work. So again, we make use of this async await syntax just to make our code a little bit more legible. Now, behind the scenes, all the same promise stuff is still going on. The interpreter is still going to make the fetch request right here, and then it's not going to execute any other code inside the function. So we're still going to make the request right here, and then essentially the interpreter is going to go off and do some other work. It's not going to immediately just like pause an execution right here. It's not going to actually await. We are not like sleeping or anything like that. Everything is still working the way that it was before. We are just using a slightly different syntax. Okay, so let's now test this out. I'm going to copy this entire snippet right here. And again, if you are not using an up-to-date version of Chrome, if you're using an old version of Internet Explorer, if you're using an old version of Firefox, if you're using Safari, this code right here is probably going to throw an error for you. So you have to be using Chrome and a reasonably up-to-date version of Chrome for this code to work. So I'm going to copy this code. I'm going to go back over to my console. I'm going to clear out the log. And I'll paste it and run it. And then just as before, I still get out the console log. So clearly, the two are equivalent in behavior. They work essentially the same way. We have only added in this new type of syntax for handling these asynchronous requests. Now, the last thing I want to say here is that we are not only restricted to using the async await syntax with functions that are declared using the function keyword. We can also use arrow functions if we choose. So let's refactor this to use an arrow function instead. I'll say const fetch albums equals await, and then I place the function that I want to mark as being asynchronous in nature. Oops, I put await, my mistake, it should be async, like so. So we say async, and then the function that is going to be containing some amount of asynchronous code. So I'm going to now copy all this. When I go back over to the browser, I am going to refresh the page. If I pasted the code that we just added and execute it, we would get a little bit of an error because I'm using the const keyword here. And whenever we use const keyword, remember we can only declare the variable once. And so if we ran it right now, we would see a little error message, but that's because of the const keyword. So I'll refresh the entire page. I will then paste that statement, and we still get the same result as before. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the async await syntax. Again, the takeaway here is that it is still behaving the exact same way behind the scenes. The only difference is that it gives us this slightly improved syntax that makes our code look a little bit more synchronous in nature. Now, before we take a pause, one last thing I want to do. I want to open up the babel.js repo, or excuse me, REPL. So I'm going to navigate to babel.js.io. I'm going to find the try it now link. So try it out right here. And then this gives us a little tool where we can paste some ES20 anything, so ES2017, whatever you want code on here, and then see the transpiled result on the right hand side. So I'm going to paste the code that we just wrote, and when I do so, you'll notice that it actually executes the code if you have evaluate up here checked. But when I paste the code, we can inspect the result over here. So this is what you actually see after that async await syntax has been parsed by Babel and translated into compatible ES5 code. So over on the right hand side, you'll see that all this async await stuff gets massively expanded over here. Like tremendous amount of code is generated by using that async await syntax. And this is everything that it takes to actually do this kind of fancy syntax. Now, one thing you might notice in here is this function called async to generator. If you look very carefully at it, and it's one very long line, you can see that it is still creating a promise behind the scenes. So here's like new promise, and it is still like essentially doing something with the promise. And so here's like promise resolved, blah, 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 and all this stuff. So there's still promises behind the scenes, but at the end of the day, it's really just because essentially at the end of the day, remember, we are just using some syntactic sugar. It is not necessarily transforming the way that JavaScript is working right now. Okay, so enough of talking about this. Again, we're going to be making use of async await throughout this course, a tremendous amount. In fact, we're probably not going to use promises again at all. We might kind of write out the next request or two as a promise and then refactor it to use async await just to make sure we're on the same page. But in general, we will use async await a lot. So at this point, I want to take a break. When we come back in the next section, we're going to go back to that passport.js file, and we're going to refactor all of this database query stuff to instead use the new async await syntax. So quick break, we'll come back and do a little refactor. So I'll see you in just a second.